now we're going to be talking about wildlife monitoring, and then what are we going to do? What are we going to do if we see some evidence of wildlife? So during the growing season, and we have a log for that on your sheet and on your USB, you want to make sure that you're monitoring for feces or other evidence of intrusion. So that could be tracks, that could be, plants that are broken up in the field, that could be
your fence taken down.
Yeah, all that good stuff. So you want to just be aware, and every grower is always scouting, even if they don't call it that, right? You're out driving your field and seeing what's going on, and you're pretty aware of what's going on. So now it's just a matter of documenting it, so you have those records. And then you want to evaluate the risk of fecal contamination on the produce. So again, if you're growing apples and you see one little pile of rabbit droppings over here, is that going to be a big risk compared to if you're growing lettuce and you see droppings right in there touching the lettuce leaves? So you want to think about that, and then consider your past observations and wildlife attractants. And then immediately prior to harvest, you again want to monitor for any fecal contamination and signs of animal activity. And then you want to assess your risks and decide if the crop or a portion of that crop can be safely harvested or not. And so we'll talk about all of that, because that's always the million-dollar question. How much land do I need to leave?
So when it comes to wildlife, it's wildlife, right? So how much time can you really devote to keeping things out of your fields? So a lot of people will focus on using decoys, and I'll say decoys work well for first little bit, and then if you're not moving them around or changing their locations, the wildlife can become habituated to them, and they figure out, you may not think they're that smart, they figure out, hey, this isn't real. It's not anything that I need to really worry with. So up top, is that a coyote? Yeah, it's coyote. And then we have our swan, which is a really good deterrent for geese especially. We also have our owl, which again is a nice predator. It helps keep a lot of our smaller birds away. You can also look for fencing and netting. Fencing's expensive though, right? And how much fencing can you really implement? We'll talk through some of the fencing that options that are out there for you. But a fence like this, you may think, oh, nothing's getting through that. I've seen deer jump over a fence that tall, no problem. Well, maybe a little bit of problem. They still make it over, right? Where there's a will, there's a way, right? So they can still make it over even though you think it's really tall. Netting, that's a bit tough. I don't see a lot of our growers implementing netting. I don't know, Annette, if you've ever seen anybody implement it.
It can keep the birds out as long until they get a nice hole in it, right? And then they'll come in. But
I think that'd be more in line for like berry patches.
yes, blueberries especially. We see that quite a bit on a smaller scale. So then other things you can use, noise deterrents. Again, they last for a while, but the wildlife is pretty smart and knows that's just a noise and it's nothing to worry about. And then things like visual deterrents, so the little scarecrows. If you get that constant motion, that does pretty well to scare things off.
We did debate getting you one of the crazy arm guys and putting that in your bag.
But it wouldn't fit in the bag.
It wouldn't fit in.
Yeah. And then tactile repellents and relocation can be an option. But again, if you have a heavy population of something, it's probably not very practical. So this is always a good point to ask people what's worked well for them for particular pests that you've seen. Does anybody have things that they want to share that have worked really well for them? Nobody?
Did you say gun? We taught this full class. We taught this full class in Georgia, and they're like, "We shoot it." I was like, "Well,
it depends."
Relocation.
Yeah.
You better be in contact with your WMA guys, or they can. I mean, that can get you in a lot of trouble.
Yep, depending on where you're relocating to. Yep.
I mean, if it's illegal to transport game, wild game. I mean, period. It's illegal to transport.
Yeah, it's going to take some coordination to
Gonna take
And it's
some.
probably not going to be you
If you
doing
trap it
everything.
like that, you're supposed to kill it, dispose of it.
And be done with it. Yep. Yeah, and that varies by state and all that good stuff. So, yep.
So, as far as birds go, try and avoid the problem. And a lot of times birds are attracted because there's something they're feeding off of. And a lot of times you're going to see this where there's either good amounts of grain located or there's waste piles, like coal piles where they can feed off of. So try and keep that problem taken care of where you're not leaving your coals piled up where they can get into it. Again, if you have grain for animals or livestock or anything like that, keep that up and away where you're not going to have basically attractants drawing them in. Try and exclude the birds by hanging plastic strips in doorways, and that's what you're seeing here. So this would work well in a packing house where you have those doorways open for airflow and things along those lines. You can also use, you can also make sure you have openings that are bigger than a half an inch, such as vents and eaves and things along those lines. Make sure you close those up because essentially a bird's or a rodent or anything's going to be able to get into those. And exclude birds from roosting sites, and we have our deterrents right here. They're basically going to keep birds from being able to nest. I'll tell you, they are still able to, if you're not watching this, they'll build their nest down here up against the wall and where these are. So you may deter some big birds, but you also have to clean out the nests that do happen to make their way in there. But that does a lot of good, and it's not so much time intensive on you trying to actively monitor that. Again, these perch repellents, the porcupine wires, are the best way to try and keep them from perching. And again, wherever a bird's perching, they're also going to be pooping. So that's our biggest thing when it comes into trying to deter them. We're going to try and especially keep them away from wherever we're harvesting crops at or have a lot of crops gathered at.
And if we're talking about a packing house scenario, a ceiling like this, of course, is going to be a lot harder for a bird to roost, or impossible for a bird to roost, versus something that has open rafters with lots of space where they could make a nest or something. So you want to be aware of that. You can screen off rafters if you have an open building like that to discourage them nesting up there.
Or even put a netting in the rafters to keep them out.
Mm-hmm. Rodent control, this is one that is always an issue on a farm, and we want to make sure that rodent control, that you have properly placed and regularly monitored and logged traps. So that's one of the things you have on your clipboard is this pest and rodent control log. And you can see that it's nothing fancy. It just has your name of your farm, and then the company that you use, if you use a pest control company or yourself, and the date of service or the action that you took, the type of pest you found, the type of control you used, location of traps. So oftentimes people number their traps 1, 2, 3, 4, 40, whatever, how many traps you have in your operation. And so you know where those locations are. You make a little map of it, and you can go around and find what traps had rodents in them. And then you just put initials of who checked the traps, the date and the person that checked the trap, and then how you disposed of them. So a simple log, but just something to record all that information.
So for rodent traps, the electric trap is a reusable trap that essentially is going to kill through electric dose. And in essence, you're going to, the mouse or rat will get zapped when they try and get to the bait inside, and they come in contact with the electrodes there. Again, it's just going to cause cardiac arrest and kill them in that way.
The mouse electric chair.
It is, in a little black box. The glue trap, again, just has glue on the base of it and is going to essentially just catch the rodents. I have seen glue traps not work very well, though. I mean, they'll drag them and they'll chew off parts of their legs. So I would say they're not as effective.
When they're slow, too.
Yeah. When we're thinking about baiting, general word of wise is if we're talking about inside the packing house, we don't like baiting inside a packing house because you're actually maybe pulling in the rodents that were otherwise on the outside. So we do like to keep the things that keep baits away so you're not actually actively attracting them versus just trapping inside the packing house and baiting outside of it.
Now you'll notice these are specified as inside or outside traps. And then these are going to be types that you would use outside only. So here, the one on the top is a bait station. It's going to be a plastic box with a rodent bait, and those baits are going to be a rodenticide. Most commonly, the over-the-counter ones we see are, someone else can pronounce these probably better than I can, Brodophoccum diphacinone. These are tongue twisters. Chlorofascinone or warfarin. Warfarin's the one that is decon that we're probably most familiar with as the active ingredients. If you are an organic farm, there is an organic bait you can use. It's this Agrid D3. It is vitamin D3. So it's concentrated vitamin D3 that'll kill them. And that's what we use on our organic farm in Knoxville. And then, of course, the spring-loaded trap that we're all familiar with.
With the rodent traps, you'll want to have that opening up against a wall or something along those lines because they tend to scurry along walls if there is a wall in sight. So that's usually how you want that to be oriented. They don't like being out in the open. It's a good way to get yourself picked off. You want to do this one?
This is just give you an example of where you might want to place traps if you have a fully enclosed packing shed. So you want to make sure that they're both inside and outside the packing house. So they use two different traps here. The yellow ones are the inside type traps, and then the blue hexagons are the outside traps. And then you want to make sure that you're placing a trap within 6 feet on either side of the door, both inside and outside. And then every 20 to 40 feet around the inner perimeter. And then outside traps, you're going to place them at 50 to 100 foot intervals around the building perimeter. And again, within 6 feet of the doors. So you're well positioned. So you can see how they would add up, and you'd want to have them numbered or some easy way to distinguish your traps, because this is just one building that you might have. So if you have multiple greenhouses, or if you have high tunnels and other things, you want to have this for each building that you have.
And then by numbering them, you can also keep track on your log records, which traps you're checking, what you're finding. Yep. In those traps. So if we're thinking about a cooler or partially enclosed sheds, again, we can have inside traps only. With this, again, you're just numbering them and putting them along that interior perimeter to basically catch any activity you have coming in there. Within the cooler itself, typically you're looking to get roughly every 20 to 40 feet around that cooler to monitor for any activity. Again, the thought is that inside the cooler you're keeping all your crops there, so you definitely want to be making sure you don't have high amounts of rodent activity. You're not going to know it other than looking for droppings unless you have these traps in place.
So mole and vole control, this is kind of one that is a good luck if you have a mole or vole problem, but some exclusion with tree guards will work for some types of moles, but it doesn't work for the pine vole. So we have about 2 or 3 species of voles that we see in Tennessee, and pine vole is one of them. And the hardware cloth can work for other types of voles, but not for that pine vole. Dr. Lockwood, talking about co-management, he's a big advocate of eliminating any weeds or ground cover or litter if you do have a vole problem, because that's good places for them to hide. There are some restricted use toxicants. Again, they don't work extremely well, and trapping can be effective if you have a very low population of moles or voles, but it's not really effective on a large scale either. So they're kind of a tricky thing to get under control if you have an issue with them. But the more open ground that you have and the predator birds can see down in, they're oftentimes your best line of defense.
For deer control, again, most people are not going to spend the money to build a fence that's tall enough, because you're really looking at getting 12-foot tall fence when you get down to it. So what's been found to work better and be a lot more resource friendly is to actually build a three-dimensional, basically, fence where deer actually don't perceive depth very well at all. So by having, you can see here, roughly a 3-foot spacing from an exterior wire to the interior wire, and the exterior wire is only going to be one wire on the top, and it's going to be roughly spaced at 34, so roughly a little bit shy of 3 feet. And then in essence, you're going to have that interior wire where it's going to have 2 wires, an upper and a lower. And then you're actually going to electrify your top wire there of both of those fences to help deter deer from making their way in. The thought is that once they go to jump, they're not going to be able to clear both sets, and you're going to hopefully keep them out. Again, a lot of times deer will break these, so you're going to have to be checking your fences a lot of the time if they do get caught in there.
Coyotes, another one that we're seeing increased populations of across the state. And so for coyote control, first you want to be able to identify that it's a coyote and not a dog that's going through your field. And so there's the tracks of both of them. You can see the coyote there. The foot pads are closer together and a little more stretched out than in a dog track. You want to make sure you're removing any carrion that might be around your farm or field, and you want to improve your animal husbandry techniques. So that's often what draws the coyotes in. If you have animals on your farm and they're coming for the animals, they're not coming for the produce, but they might travel through your vegetable field on the way to get to your sheep or whatnot. Things that work for them are leg hold traps and snares. Of course, shooting is one, but it depends on where you are, if you're in city limits or not, and we're seeing more and more coyotes in the city. And then direct control toward the troublemaker, because usually it's not the whole coyote population. There's one in the bunch that's going after the animals and causing the issues there. So there's more information in your resources, but this came from a publication called Controlling Coyotes in Tennessee. So it was Tennessee specific. I think I skipped one there.
Nope. So for wild hog management, we're seeing, as you can tell maybe by the picture here, more and more wild hog presence, especially in southern, middle to West Tennessee, and really all throughout East Tennessee in general. And I don't know if this is going to continue to spread outwards. I mean, it's definitely something I've noticed more and more. So in essence, from 88 to 2009, we saw 118% rate of land area increase for the United States, and roughly a 5%. And then from 2009 to 2013, we saw a 34% rate of land area expansion within the United States. So again, just looking at the populations, that we're going to see more and more people building out, and that may be concentrating some of these wild hogs onto your farmland more and more, where you didn't necessarily have problems before. We have a landowner's guide for wild pig management here, and that's through Mississippi State Cooperative Extension, that may have some good tips and tricks for trying to control if you
We're
have
not going to get
issues.
into too much on wild hogs. We're no wild hog experts for sure.
No.
But looking at that map, you see the problem they have in Texas, the problem they have in Florida. So we're kind of, they're pushing them towards us as they leave those states. So yeah, definitely on the rise. Woo. There we go. All right, so wildlife and livestock interactions. The pathogens can transfer from the wildlife to livestock if you also have a livestock operation, and those pathogen loads in the domesticated animals may be species specific and impacted by the animal management practices on your farm. So you want to be cognizant of that. And then shared grazing land and water sources may offer contamination pathways among species. So if you do have that cattle pond, the deer are coming to it as well. There's where you're getting some contamination between the species.
So people love, we call our dog back there Rudy, but people love their companions, right? But in reality, they also can carry a lot of these bacterial foodborne pathogens. And again, you're not watching them when they're out in the field, so we're also trying to limit their access to the land, as well as your packing houses. Again, we also have a history of domesticated animals being used as draft animals, and also as wildlife deterrents, because the dogs can run off the geese and things along those lines that may be coming in. You also have practices where you may have different management practices where you actually bring in grazing animals to clear out culls, or even get underneath orchard canopies and things along those lines. Always think about how risks are going to be introduced to your land through these domestic animals, and don't basically discount them. And Rover looks fine, shouldn't be any problem, because many times they're going to be looking perfectly healthy and still able to carry these foodborne pathogens.
So, things to assess risks regarding domesticated animals. Are domesticated animals allowed in the field while the crop is present as part of your production process? So are they working animals? We have an Amish community in Tennessee, and they rely on their draft animals to work their fields and also for harvest purposes. So there's nothing wrong with that. You just want to be aware of that and minimize the risks associated with using those draft animals. Are your workers aware of cross-contamination risks from fecal contamination on their hands, on their clothes, on their shoes, and equipment after they're handling animals or the fecal material? And then are production fields rotated into grazing land? If manure is going to be present on the ground, one recommendation is just to extend that period between when the animals are there and were grazed and when you start to put plants in the ground and are producing your crop. So there's always something you can do to minimize your risk.
And at the beginning we said it's always good to assess risk before you actually plant, because that's when, once you're invested and have something planted, it's a bit too late to decide, oh, I should have done something differently. So assess the field location. Look at the topography. Again, you're going to be looking for runoff contamination coming from higher ground, wind patterns. We were talking about, with riparian areas and things along those lines. A lot of times tree buffers are really nice to windbreaks to actually provide some nice wind. So if you do have livestock on one side of you, they may provide a nice windbreak, because these microorganisms, people don't think about it, but they're very small and they can fly on dust particles, and they can easily make their way hundreds of feet away from where they originated at. Also think about definitely water movement. Water is one of the best ways for moving around these foodborne pathogens. So again, not only runoff from rain events, but could you have flooding events, things along those lines, and what does that mean? Even though it doesn't happen, hopefully, regularly. Think about previous uses. Was this land used for grazing livestock, landfills, manure applications, and things along those lines that could all introduce risk? And again, impact of domesticated animals in that area, especially from a farming stance. Adjacent land uses, again, you can't control what your neighbors are doing, but always try and think about how can you manage where your livestock are and get them as far away as possible. But it's not only the animals themselves. If you have compost piles or manure piles that you're keeping, again, keep that as far away as possible from the fields that you're planting in. Again, you're going to be attracting a lot of wildlife and insects to that area with that manure, in addition to the runoff risk.
We'll address the very first one on the second line.
Previous uses of grazing?
No, under assessing adjacent land.
Oh, residential and commercial and other land uses. Yeah, so can't really do a whole lot about what your neighbors sell out, and all of a sudden you have a big subdivision going in behind you or something like that. Yeah.
Where we grow a lot of our stuff just across the fence. They're building a subdivision as we speak.
Yep. And in essence, it's hard to take those practices into place, and it may be a good idea, and maybe you build up a berm or something like that to try and help and protect yourself.
Well,
The fence
actually,
road stays.
Yeah.
yeah, but I understand where you're coming from. But actually, our property line runs right there. but the way the ground lays on their side of that, it kind of goes away from us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because there's a natural drain out there, probably 300-400 foot that it's fall into.
So they're going to be draining away from
Yeah,
you.
and then down. I mean, we've got one corner that could potentially, it's a small area,
Yeah.
potentially, but I don't think so because the way the ground actually lays up there.
And when people start to build closer to you, you also think about septic tank locations, if there's going to be septic installed, and there's leaching fields. And this is really becoming more of an issue as people start to build and more, right? So I'll say it's something that's not going to get, it's only going to become more of an issue to growers where it hasn't maybe been in the past. But yeah, definitely something to think about. For the wildlife risk, thinking about the number, the movement, and the likelihood of fecal contamination. When it comes to risk, you're never down to zero with anything that we talk about, but just trying to minimize where you can. And essentially, you get to a point where there's diminishing returns, is what I like to say. So try and have those practices in place where you do deter wildlife, and just have good records in place to show what you're doing to control for them.
All right, so working animals, the best way you're going to minimize risk for those is to not allow them in the field when the edible portion of the crop is present. So if you're using a working animal to till up the field, that's a different thing than if you're using them during harvest. If you do need to use them close to harvest, you want to do things like establish paths, just like we would for a spray row. Establish paths where you're going to minimize that contact with the growing area, and then have an SOP that outlines your practices if the animal does go to the bathroom in the field or on the produce or near the produce. So anyone that works with animals should understand those risks and be trained to minimize risks. And then you want to develop all your SOPs for animal and manure handling. So hand washing, cleaning and sanitizing, practices to complete after you are handling the animals. So you might have a different pair of boots that you use when you're working with the animals, and then if you're going in the packing house, you change those out so you don't have the risk of tracking something in on your shoes, something like that. This is just showing an example of ways that draft animals are used. You can see here, these folks are tilling up their field with their horses, and then up there, they're actually working right in the high tunnel. So obviously one is going to carry more risk than the other here, but that's what works for this operation. So again, having those SOPs in place of how you're going to minimize risks that arise.
For pets, again, pets need to be excluded from the produce field. As much as people like to have their dogs present, and if you're a cat person, I suppose your cats, or a lot of times people like to use cats as their rodent control, but don't recommend that. So visitors, a lot of people are doing U-picks and things along those lines, and we're trying to get people out to the farm more and more. So visitors to the farm should be instructed to leave their pets at home, and a lot of times it's something you need to be cognizant of, especially if you're using a U-pick. If you're doing, a lot of farms are doing agritourism, right? Because it's trying to come at all angles to bring in revenue. So anyone with petting zoos should have hand washing sinks available and signage instructing visitors to actually wash their hands before they go and maybe pick produce or something like that if you have a multifaceted operation.
And you'll notice that it says leave their pets at home. We had somebody that had a sign that said leave your dogs at home. Somebody showed up with their pet raccoon on their shoulder. So that's why you want to have that catch-all. Whatever your pet is, leave it at home. We don't want your raccoon or your dog in our field.
Yeah, so
this one, oftentimes people think their cats, they're good rodent control, right? But if you do have folks that are buying your produce, they're in that immunocompromised population. Cats carry toxoplasmosis, which can be transmitted to pregnant women. So not a good idea to have your cat as your rodent control. We love this dog.
He's great.
He's versatile.
You can tell how happy he is too, right? To be there in the middle of everything.
What kind of food safety concerns do you see here? He's sitting on our straw bale, right? Not good there. He's climbing up to help us harvest our fruit trees. So he's on that ladder exactly where we're going to put our hands and then pick those apples. He's right in the back of that truck with the apples we just harvested. He might slobber if he gets a little hot back there. He's eating some corn. He's laying in the middle of the okra patch. So we love our dogs, but we want to be aware of what they're doing and how that could impact our food safety.
Yeah, and dogs, it's not only if they happen to, a lot of times they can have these pathogens and not be sick at all. They don't really make them ill. In addition, like I have dogs. My dogs will find the most disgusting things to roll in, to eat, to bring up. So again, it's just that they're going to be the way that they are. So it's better just to limit their access to your fields. So as far as a pre-harvest assessment goes, you're going to need to have some process in place before you actually start to harvest your crop to help determine if you have fecal contamination present. Or signs indicate a risk, such as you see a lot of tracks in the field, trampling. You're seeing a lot of basically animal activity without seeing the actual feces. And so here's an example. If you're wondering, well, how would I know? Well, you're gonna see it because they're gonna be getting into your crops when they're going through there and foraging. The rule is that fresh produce which has been contaminated cannot be harvested. Are you going to know it's contaminated? The rule is wherever there's contact, you're going to assume that it has been contaminated. Again, as far as corrective actions go, what most people would do is set up a no harvest buffer zone. So it's not that this whole field necessarily is a wash, but you're going to set up a perimeter around where you have seen activity and basically not harvest within that region. Again, after you've established that harvest can safely proceed and you can continue going through for the rest of the field.
So with fecal contamination, people are always interested in how much do I need to cordon off? And you're not going to see a number in print for that anywhere necessarily. But again, it's going to depend on what your crop is and in how much fecal contamination you're seeing. And so you have to make that judgment as the producer of what would be a reasonable amount to cordon off so you're not selling that produce that's potentially contaminated to your customers. So when we were doing those food safety decision trees, we went round and around about, do we put an actual number in there? Because that's what people always want to know. How much do I have to cordon off? Well, you don't see that because, again, it's very site specific and it's amount specific and crop specific and all of those things.
So if you find contamination, don't harvest the produce that you know has become contaminated or would assume has become contaminated through contact. Again, determine if no harvest buffer zones around that contamination are sufficient to reduce the risk of having contaminated produce actually being harvested. Again, as Annette was saying, nobody's going to give you an exact amount because they range anywhere from 0 to 25 feet. And there's a lot of people that we work with. They said, well, if I cordoned off 25 feet everywhere, I found animal activity, I would have nothing left to harvest. So again, take within respect what makes the most sense from you and how much risk you're willing to assume also. I mean, some people may say, I'm just going to get it out of the field, and beyond that, I'm not going to do anything. And you know, it's all about how much risk you're willing to assume. And other people say, nope, I'm going to stick to a 3-foot or 5-foot radius, and I'm going to implement wherever I find activity. Consider other corrective actions that could reduce contamination risk, also such as implementing, one of the deterrents that we talked about, so you can actually hopefully keep them from coming back into the field also.
And then you want to make a decision about what to do with the contamination. So are you going to remove it? Are you going to leave it? Are you going to bury it? Or are you going to use some other strategy to get it out of your field? And then you want to consider the risks that could result from these actions. So if you're getting it out of the field, removing it, make sure you have a shovel that's designated for that purpose, and you're not using that shovel to then, or a hoe or something, and getting the contamination out on the hoe and then going and hoeing your crop with it, because that of course would contribute to cross-contamination. So you want to have different color handled tools or something, and everybody knows that those are specifically for removing contamination from the field. And then after you do that job, we want you to go and wash your hands before you're harvesting or doing anything else with the produce. And then of course you want to document all your actions. And so that's going to be your monitoring, your deterrence, and your corrective actions. And we have logs for that on your USB that we gave you.
So worker training is always going to be your biggest key, because they're going to be the people out in the field actually harvesting and actually seeing the signs of animal intrusion. So workers need to have training so they recognize when contaminations occurred, and definitely don't harvest any crop which may be contaminated. They also need to know how to inspect and correct for problems when they see with harvest containers and equipment, or report issues to a supervisor so that they do not become a contamination source. So if you've been going through and harvesting and something's made its way that could be contaminated into a container, a piece of equipment, then going through and fully sanitizing that so you kind of stop the issue at hand. Workers need to be able to take measures to not harvest contaminated produce. I think that's now the third time they said that. So that's really key. You don't want to be harvesting anything that could be contaminated. And always wash hands anytime they've been handling animal feces if you're removing it from the field. And workers should always report food safety concerns to a supervisor, so ultimately you can decide how to, if you want to take extra steps as far as deterrents go, if you want to have increased monitoring, and definitely they need to know how to document everything.
And that last one's really key, because you want your workers to know that you take food safety seriously on your farm as well. So if they tell you something and they see that nothing happens, they're going to say, oh, this isn't really a priority. I'm not going to tell them next time that I see the fence is down. I'm just going to leave it and go on because I have other things to do. You know, we got to get this out of the field. We got to get this weeded. And so you want to make sure that you make food safety part of the culture on your farm, and make sure that your workers know that it is important, and reward it and let them know that if they tell you something, you're taking it seriously. So record keeping, you'll notice here the words must and should. Records that must be kept in regard to wildlife and domesticated animals is your worker training. So that's really key, making sure that your workers know what to do. Records that should be kept are the pre-plant land assessments, monitoring for animal activity, and any actions you're going to take to reduce those risks related to animal intrusion into your crop. And then your pre-harvest risk assessment, so that they know that you went through right before you're harvesting, and any intrusion or contamination events that you find, and then all the corrective actions that you might have taken. Jeez.
And this is just an example of a record. Again, the key points to any record are the title of whatever it is, so people can clearly see what record they're dealing with. The actual date the observation was made on, describing the field or the location where the observation took place, essentially asking, did you note wildlife intrusion? And then if the answer is yes, well then what corrective actions were taken? When were those corrective actions actually implemented? And the initials of whoever's creating that record. Ultimately, any record that's created needs to be reviewed by a member of management before essentially that produce definitely goes to market. Generally speaking, we like to have it reviewed, on a weekly basis. It really depends upon what makes the most sense for your operation, but definitely before that product goes to market. This is kind of your management practice for actually determining, is what you put in your SOPs actually take place? Was a proper response implemented? And down here at the bottom, you'll note that it's reviewed by, there's a place to sign, what their title is, and what date this was reviewed on.
So in summary, feces and urine from domesticated and wild animals can contaminate your produce and your water sources. You want to conduct those pre-planting and pre-harvest assessments. Presence of animals in the environment does not necessarily mean that your produce is contaminated. So use common sense and look for the clues that we've talked about here. If animal intrusion does occur, the field needs to be monitored during the growing season for evidence of contamination, and then take steps to reduce that risk from animals. Co-management, again, consider the balance of food safety and your conservation goals on your farm, and then document all actions that you're taking to reduce your risk from animal and adjacent land use. We have a list of additional resources here, so we could spend a lot of time on many of these things. If you are not sure what might be the animal that's coming into your farm, Penn State has a nice wildlife damage CSI online module. It's about an hour long. You can watch that. There's the Internet Center for Wildlife Damage and Management. And Tennessee, through the TDA, there's a Tennessee Nuisance Animal Damage Control website, and that is where we got some information on the wild hogs and the coyotes, so that's a good resource as well. And then Penn State also has a publication on controlling birds around farm buildings, and Hawaii has a publication on controlling rodents in and around packing shed. So all good resources for you to use.